Coming up, kings yelling, drunk reporters, bad translations, and more. Join us as we have a look at some of the worst miscalculations and miscommunications in history. Berlin. In 1989 in Berlin, the Cold War was dividing the city. Communism didn't look so hot, and the Iron Curtain was crumbling. Due to sketchy legal practices, many East Germans were able to flee into Hungary and cross into West Germany from there. The East German government wasn't exactly keen on the loophole, so they decided to issue temporary visas. This would allow people to pass through the Berlin Wall. So then East Germany had all of these temporary passes as a way to calm the masses and to restore order. Now, the plan may have worked, but they didn't tell the one man who was supposed to deliver the news on television, a relatively unknown reporter by the name of Günter Schabowski. Schabowski was a heavy drinker and was also hungover when he was to deliver the important news on November 9th of 1989. After a pretty boring and distracted speech, Günter was then forced to answer reporters' questions. So, when an Italian reporter would ask when the new visas would go into effect, he sweated and stuttered immediately. That's when the entire room would explode into chaos as people ran out trying to get their visas. In shock, Günter went to say that anyone who had a passport was automatically eligible and didn't need to apply. Thousands of people would flood the wall, and the border guards had no idea what to do. Because of the conflicting orders, the barrier came down and the Cold War ended. All because no one told Günter the right things to say. Japan. The phrase lost in translation can come up when you miss the point that someone's trying to get at, usually in another language or through text. If this has happened to you and made you look foolish, well, it could have been worse. That's because after victory across Europe in World War II, the leaders of the Allies, Truman, Churchill, Stalin, and others, demanded an answer from Japan. The Allies didn't want to have to invade Japan on soil and hoped to avoid the slaughter. However, the Japanese government would consider their options in silence, and when reporters would hound the Prime Minister for an answer to the question that was on everyone's mind, he simply uttered "mokusatsu." This is probably the saddest and most tragic mistranslation that the world has ever known. That's because the word has several meanings, and in the context that the Prime Minister meant it as "no comment." Unfortunately, it was badly translated to the Allies with the meaning "not worthy of comment, held in silent contempt." It was at this point in the war that the Allies were tired and angry, and a single word error would be the last straw. America took the word as an insult and a rejection of the offer of peaceful surrender. This response led to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, the worst civilian casualty action ever recorded. Over 130,000 people were killed that day, and this one tiny mistake led to the only use of nuclear warfare in history. Light Brigade. The charge of the Light Brigade is widely heralded as being one of the dumbest military actions that was ever performed by the British aristocracy. At the time, officer positions were bought for enormous sums of money. So, if you were rich and also British, you could become an officer, a leader of men, in battle. This was a poorly thought out plan. Lord Raglan really drives this point home. Being the commander of the British forces that fought Russia in Crimea in 1854, he would send a messenger with an order that read, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns." You see, Raglan wanted the Russians to be unable to move the guns to new positions, and because the guns were incredibly heavy, he imagined the British riding up and cutting down the opposition, or the Russians simply fleeing from the assault. However, the cavalry couldn't actually see the guns, because Raglan didn't take their position into consideration. Lord Lucan, who was actually leading the cavalry, read the order and asked Captain Nolan, the messenger, which lines they were actually supposed to attack. Now, Nolan was a capable captain who had risen through the ranks, and he gave a wide sweep of his arm, probably in disgust about the whole operation. However, Lucan thought that he meant a suicide mission. While a discussion of tactics was probably in order for an issue as big as this, Lucan and his brigade leader, Lord Cardigan, hated each other and weren't on speaking terms. Lucan would shrug his shoulders and sent Lord Cardigan charging to his death. Nolan would be the first to die, and the entire brigade would then be slaughtered. Wounded Knee. In tense situations, it can be hard to stop and imagine how someone else is feeling, and sometimes this can lead to horrors. In 1890, most of the Native American population of the United States was being moved to reserves, and since they were being forced to live on government handouts that were faulty and slow to arrive, many would get upset and driven into despair. The American government was particularly tense after a special ritual called the Ghost Dance began to sweep the nation. This dance was thought to bring the spirits of ancestors and the buffalo back. But the government actually thought that the Native Americans were planning war. This would lead to Sitting Bull being shot by a lawman on the Standing Rock Reservation. 2 weeks later, Major Samuel Whitside and his troops intercepted a party of Lakota Sioux on their way to Pine Ridge Reservation. The troop escorted the party to Wounded Knee, but demanded that they surrender their weapons. While many complied, one man, by the name of Black Coyote, held onto his rifle. He did this because the rifle was so expensive, and also because he was deaf and couldn't hear the commands. A trooper would come by to grab it, and Black Coyote held it aloft, claiming its value. A small scuffle ensued, and a shot rang off. Now, to this day, no one really knows who shot first, but it led to panic among the soldiers, and they massacred the now unarmed Lakota. While some were able to pick up their guns and fight back, they were destroyed by field artillery guarding the surrounding hills. Trenton. The American Revolution was an important point in history that almost didn't happen. In 1776, Washington was having a really hard time liberating his country. He lost 4,000 men, and the men he did have were hungry, cold, and tired. After failing to hold the lower Hudson Valley, Washington knew things were in despair, and that he needed bold, decisive action to win the day. So that's when he would opt to cross the Delaware and attack a tiny town by the name of Trenton, the home of a large force of Hessian soldiers. This is all pretty straightforward history book stuff that you learn in school, and Washington was betting everything on his move. But what the first president didn't know was that he was being watched. A loyalist farmer had been observing the troops marching and, guessing Washington's plan, would run ahead to warn the Germans. When the farmer arrived, he found most of the garrison sleeping. The commander was busy playing cards and left explicit orders not to be disturbed. Now, this might have rankled the farmer, but he quickly jotted down a note that one of the commander's guards said he would deliver. Alas, like many of the troops, the commander couldn't read English. So instead of immediately trying to find a translator, he stuffed the note in his pocket and went back to playing cards. After the Americans would swoop in secretly and win the game-changing victory, the note would be found on his body in his pocket. Beckett. Now, if you've ever hired a friend at work, you might think that having them on the team is a great way to goof off or even just have fun. But that was probably what King Henry II's thoughts were when he appointed Thomas Becket. Becket would become the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. And maybe it doesn't involve any goofing off, but Henry did want someone that he could trust in the position. Unfortunately for the king, Becket would immediately undergo a change of faith, and in such a high office, became popular with the peasants, and there wasn't really a whole lot that the king could do about it because of Becket's devotion. 2 years would go by with Becket pestering King Henry when the king had had enough. He would order Becket to be arrested on false charges, and Becket slipped into exile. Then eventually, in 1170, the two men would come to an agreement, and Becket would return to England. He then excommunicated one of Henry's favorite bishops. And this, well, it made the king understandably upset. He stalked the halls of the castle, ranting to himself, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" Now, sometimes it's better to rant in quiet, because a group of knights who overheard the tirade took it as an order and went out in broad daylight, dragged Becket into the public square, and murdered him in a brutal fashion. This almost led to a civil war in England, all because Henry couldn't take out his rage more quietly. Tenerife. The deadliest accident in aviation history was also caused by just a severe miscommunication. At Tenerife Airport in 1977, two Boeing 747 jets would crash into each other, killing 580 people. This would be a perfect storm of horrifying coincidence. Because of a terrorist action at another nearby airport, Tenerife would be overly congested, and many planes blocked the taxiway, forcing many of the planes to taxi onto the runway. When flight KLM 4805 would miss their correct taxi lane, a dense fog had settled onto the airport, and they ended up in the path of Pan Am Flight 1746. Facing them, a tired crew aboard the KLM mistook the air traffic controller's orders and initiated a takeoff at the exact time that the Pan Am was taxiing forward. The towers were unable to properly communicate to KLM what was happening, and the captain put the plane forward at takeoff speed. Out of the fog, just 300 feet away, the Pan Am plane would appear. Pan Am's captain tried to steer off into the grass, but the KLM flight was traveling too fast and the planes would collide. Once the engine and fuel tank would spark, everyone aboard the KLM was killed in an instant. But thanks to the Pan Am pilot's steering, just 61 people survived the horrific devastation, all caused by one small miscommunication. Depending on where you are, getting low could be the difference between third-degree burns, followed by vaporization in a matter of seconds, or surviving, with possible second-degree burns on your exposed skin. Another thing that Bert the Turtle had going for him was also his shell, which actually does have some basis in good nuclear survival advice. One of the things that'll kill you is the thermal radiation, which can be blocked by literally anything that can cast a